karaoke club in Tacoma, Washington. And he was almost left for dead. In fact, it's almost a miracle that he survived. But what's very interesting about his case is that because of that mugging, certain parts of his brain overcompensated for the parts of his brain that were not able to function correctly anymore. And so suddenly, he found himself in possession of a gift that no one in the world had had up until this time. It's not in recorded history. Every time he looked at anything in the world around him, he would see it as a particular geometric shape, often being, expressing very clear mathematical principles and formulae that, well, people wouldn't normally think of when they're looking at a branch, for instance, or a house, like the Pythagorean theorem, things like that. And so whenever he would look at anything, all of a sudden he would have all of this information coming into his brain. And he became basically a genius with regard to geometry. Strangely enough, he had dropped out of college. He didn't like math before that, and he certainly was not an artist of any kind, but he couldn't turn off that gift that he now had. In fact, he would be able to write all these geometric shapes into these fabulous pictures that, frankly, now were consuming his life. He even admitted that at times he wished that he could turn it off, because it was always there. And yet he himself had to admit that the benefits were much better and greater than the worst part of what had happened to him. Now, it's kind of interesting. I think as we live in a sinful world as Christians, and as we realize that, boy, there are certain things that people in this world just do not know, and some of them will refuse to understand, we have to realize that we have been given a gift. And that gift is godly wisdom. It's not something that we could have figured out by ourselves. The fact that God loves us, the fact that He sent His Son to save us from our sins, the fact that we are His own dear children simply through faith in Jesus Christ, that's what we call godly wisdom. Today we're going to be looking at the difference between godly wisdom and earthly wisdom, and how, unfortunately, sometimes we as Christians tend to turn off the godly wisdom that we know to be true. So as we continue our series in the letter of James, as we look at chapter 3, we're going to be continuing to look at that theme of faith. I know you're in there. Show yourself. And today we see that it shows itself by godly wisdom. We look at James chapter 3, starting at verse 13. And I believe in the bulletin it only goes through verse 16. I'd like you to go through verse 18, which I believe is going to be on the screen behind you. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. This is the word of our Lord. First thing I think that we'd like to talk about is just, what is wisdom? Probably different people would have a different take on that, depending on who you're talking to. But I think we would tend to agree with the statement that people aren't just born with wisdom. And some people can have smarts, some people can have an above-average intelligence. But is that always translated into wisdom? No. In fact, I would tend to think that maybe wisdom is using the experience that you have experienced over your years and realizing, okay, maybe I'm going to do something a little bit differently than what I would have done earlier in my life. I think that's what wisdom is. And so when you get to meet people who are older, they tend to have more wisdom because they've frankly experienced more of life. Just bringing that up, the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Do you know some people in your life that are really intelligent, but frankly are not wise? Okay, we probably have them all in our families, right? Maybe you're one of them. I don't know. Maybe I'm one of them in my family. But it seems like, there are certain people who just, they can crack open a book and they just get everything that's in there. And they get all the different nuances of the knowledge and everything else, and they can regurgitate it on a test and everything else, and they're really good at that. And then they get out into the real world, outside of the classroom, and they're just a basket case. Because they can't deal with the things that are coming at them, the real-life situations that are coming at them. So there's obviously a difference between intelligence and wisdom. And here we're talking about earthly intelligence and earthly wisdom. Well, now if you're talking about wisdom, there's also a difference between a godly wisdom and an earthly wisdom. How do we get wisdom? The Bible tells us about ways that we get wisdom. In fact, listen to some of the things that the Bible shows of how we receive wisdom. Proverbs 29, verse 15 says this: "The rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a child left to himself disgraces his mother." I think we have to agree with that one, right? Of course, it's biblical, so it should. But that's the old spare the rod, spoil the child. Proverbs has a lot of practical, everyday wisdom for us. If you know anyone who raises their child and pretty much lets them run all over the place and kind of run the house, frankly, you realize that that child is not getting a good dose of wisdom. Of course, kids don't like to learn wisdom the hard way. But unfortunately, sometimes that's the best way to learn. In fact, I would tend to say that the best learning that I've ever had in my life is from all the mistakes that I've made. And so you probably say that I'm very wise by this time, because I've made plenty of mistakes. You're probably in the same boat. Right? As we continue to live our lives, we understand that there are just certain things that you need to learn. Why is it that your mother or your father would tell you, don't touch that hot burner? Because they know, you know that one, what's going to happen to you? You're going to get burned. Exactly right. Okay? So they're showing love to you, but you know what? They might have to slap your hand away a few times if you really think that nice hot stove is kind of fun to play with. Okay? They're imparting to you wisdom. Now that's just regular wisdom. And of course that's important for parents to give to their children. But James is talking about something much more important than even regular earthly wisdom. He's talking about godly wisdom. See, earthly wisdom is good to an extent. Because obviously you don't want your children to touch hot burners on the stove. They can get burned. You need to teach them what life is all about, or they'll have difficulties later on. But most importantly, parents need to teach their children godly wisdom. The things that you're not going to learn in the school of hard knocks. The things that you're not going to learn in this world from the wisdom of the world. Godly wisdom has to come from God himself. And apparently, as James was writing this letter to Christians in the early first century of Judea and the surrounding areas, he saw some evidence that, frankly, those Christians were not putting into practice their godly wisdom. In fact, you can kind of get that as you read between the lines of what he's saying here. He says, verse 13, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. Humility that comes from wisdom. Oftentimes that's a theme in the Bible. This idea that it's not the great, the mighty of this world who are the greatest and the mightiest. It's actually the weak in this world who are often the strongest. It's often those who are seen as the cast-offs of society that have true wisdom and true worth. It's the small things that God has chosen to shame the great. In fact, listen to what the Apostle Paul says. He says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." Because the message of the cross is the wisdom of God. That God would send his Son into this world to suffer and die for us, that some Jewish peasant is actually God himself come in the flesh to save his sinful creatures who have often misused their gifts that God has given to them or not applied them in their lives, as James is talking about. That doesn't make any sense to earthly wisdom. But the Apostle Paul says that that is the wisdom of God. He says, "Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God." And unfortunately, James was seeing that the Christians of his day were kind of putting that wisdom on the back burner. Do we do that? Do we know what our God has done for us, and yet when we get out into the real world, do we just kind of keep that knowledge to ourselves, that wisdom to ourselves? Do we kind of not let it show too much so we don't have to endure ridicule from co-workers, from family members, from neighbors? It sure is easy to do that. That seems to be one of the problems that was happening in the first century as well. Very easy for us to fall into that. It's so easy for us to be part of this world. Because unfortunately, we are sinners in a sinful world. We get along with this world, unfortunately, all too well because of our sinful nature that still lives in us. And so it's always going to be difficult for us to let that godly wisdom show itself. In fact, as you think of the wisdom of this world, I think you probably would tend to think, if you came up with who were the wisest people that have ever lived on planet Earth, what do you think are some names that you might come up with? Solomon, there's good. That's a good one. I was a very good one too. Yeah. Who else? Einstein. No? I think time made him the greatest man and the greatest person in the 20th century. Anybody else who you would assume is on the top 10 or top 100 list of people who are wise? Winston Churchill? Yeah, I think I saw that one on there. I think you think of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. When you think of the philosophers, okay, from all kinds of different countries. The problem with most of their wisdom, though, is that it is the wisdom of the world. Warren Buffett, I know, was on a list. He often gets on those lists of who are the wisest people in the world. Who's Warren Buffett? One of the richest men in the world. Why? He's okay. He knows investing. Okay, the greatest investor of all time. I'm not even sure what is the second most wealthy or wealthiest person in the world. First, he's wealthy. Okay. And well, what do they have? $40-60 billion. I don't think it's really. But don't we tend to think, boy, I sure wish I could be a lot more like Warren Buffett. If only I just knew when to invest and what to invest in, and I could put that money to work, and I could gain a great return. Oh, I wish I had that wisdom that he has. How does he do it? And unfortunately, I think we tend to forget, you know what? We have a wisdom that far surpasses that earthly wisdom that Warren Buffett has, or that Socrates had, or any other person in this world. Solomon was the one who understood it. The Bible calls him the wisest man in this world. Unfortunately, what did Solomon do? He had that gift of godly wisdom, and he squandered it. He was the king of God's people, and he did all kinds of things that, frankly, the kings of this world would do. He had a huge harem. He had hundreds of wives, hundreds of concubines. He went after other gods because of those wives and concubines, so that they were dragging him away from the true God, the true wisdom of this world. It wasn't until later on in his life that he really came back to his wisdom, it seems. Because it seems that he wrote Ecclesiastes later on in life. And this is what he said. Now remember, this is Solomon, who has experienced everything that this world can give him, all the riches that he could fathom, all the pleasures that this world could afford. And he talks about that in his book. And yet he says all of that is a chasing after the wind. It's meaningless. This is what he says true wisdom is. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. Well, that doesn't sound real exciting. You're just going to work every day and just saying, okay, well, this is worth it. You see where his wisdom is pointing him, though? It's saying, why are you striving after all of these grandiose things, oftentimes with this selfish ambition, this envy that James is talking about, that can very often become a part of us, and become too close of a friend to us. And start nudging out of our faith, frankly, out of our life. And Solomon says, you know, if you can wake up every day and realize that you've done a good day's work, you can go home content. No, you might not have all the wealth of the world, power, prestige, but you can say, you know what? I did what I needed to do today, and I can be happy with that. Why would he come to that point after he had experienced everything in this world? If you look at the book of Ecclesiastes, he's talking about the fact that he had all of that stuff of the world, and it didn't give him any peace. Until he realized that life without God will give you no peace. It's only when you understand that when you have God in your life, and that you're showing it and living it, that's where contentment comes from. How often have we chased after the things of this world? How often have we wanted the things that this world thinks is wise and worth pursuit, and unfortunately neglected our own faith life, our connection with our Savior? If you're like me, we have to admit all too often that's happened. When we go back to the wisdom of God, which is foolishness to the world. But when we see at the foot of the cross that there Jesus suffered and died for the times when I wandered away from him, when I wanted other things in this world instead of what I already had in him, it's then that I realized, wow, he paid even for those selfish things. Envy. Selfish ambition, paid for it in full by Jesus Christ. And so when you are at that foot of the cross, isn't that where you also can see godly wisdom and understand really what this life is all about? What better thing can you do as a parent than raising your children in the Lord and making sure that they understand that wisdom of God. What better thing can you do in this life as you live your life other than not striving after the things that this world sees as important, but striving after the things that God sees as important? That's where you will find fulfillment. Because you're not going to be serving yourself. You will have been served by God and His grace, and then you'll be serving others. In fact, listen to what James says. He says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. There are plenty of people in this world who were not wise by human standards. Can you think of a man who built a big boat? It took him 120 years to do it. You think he got a little bit of ridicule for that? Yeah. How foolish do you think the people at that time thought when they saw Noah and his family in that boat and they were on the outside? How about a man who was surrounded by an army of 185,000 vicious soldiers and a king that wanted nothing less than the destruction of the city that this king was in? What did Hezekiah do? He simply prayed to the Lord for deliverance. The next morning he woke up, and what had happened to that army? Completely destroyed. That's wisdom from God. And the greatest wisdom, of course, is you understanding that God sent His Son into this world to pay for your sin. There's no reason to go chasing after everything else in this world, because it is fleeting, and eventually it will become nothing. But that wisdom of God, sins forgiven through faith in Christ Jesus, heaven is our eternal home. That is true wisdom. And God bless you as you continue to show that wisdom off in your life. Amen. You think of